Good morning. This is Everest Base Camp. This is my tent here. It's an absolute shambles. We're going to be spending up to 45 days living here, recovering between our rotations. This is the man in charge. He's climbed Everest goodness knows how many times, and he's making the decisions up on the mountain. And that's our route from base camp up to the higher parts of the mountains, and arguably one of, if not the most dangerous part of climbing Everest. Every time we go through that is a bit like Russian roulette. Just arrived at one of the tricky sections on the Cumbre icefall. The ice doctors have put in a line. We'll clip into that, so if we fall then we'll only fall so far. This will give you a bit of a feel for just how sketchy what we're doing here on Everest is. This is not health and safety, this is horrendous. And I'm next. Oh God. We're now at Camp 2, Everest, in a humongous storm. It's gone on all night. Crikey, I really don't know what to say. I was just not expecting this at all. You can see our tents, most of them are now flattened, and yeah, it's just going to be a case of grab the kit we can carry, and we've got a 8-hour descent over the most technical part of Mount Everest, so it's not good, not a good situation. We're well over 7,000 meters now, and I can feel it. Just today, it's quite relentless up the L7P face, and you'll be able to see where we've come from, and that's where we'll be going tomorrow morning, resting for a few hours, and after that we're going to be heading up there, and that is Mount Everest.
Welcome everybody to La Séptima Puerta from Spain, the seventh door in English. My name is Laila Kanji, and today we have with us an amazing man. His name is Nick Hollis and is from UK.
He is a motivational speaker, international mountain and expedition leader, ultra-endurance athlete, and sports nutritionist. He was in the 7 summits, and behind me you can see a Nick Hollis picture from Everest. So he is going to share with us his incredible experience climbing the Everest. Welcome Nick to the 7th door, La Séptima Puerta, and thanks so much for your time.
And good morning. Honestly, it's a real pleasure to be here, and yeah, thanks for inviting me onto the show.
Okay, Nick, so for the people who doesn't know you, we kind of start from the beginning, so maybe you can share with us a little bit about your amazing job in UK and, for example, in Fitways Adventures, please.
I'd be delighted. And in fact, I can go back a little bit further than that, because I went to university. I finished university, and I, like many people, ended up in the corporate world. And I spent 15 years working for big corporate organizations. And the last 10 years of my career I spent with Hewlett-Packard, the largest IT company in the world. And while I was following this corporate career, I was also trying to develop myself as a mountaineer, as a climber. And it got to the point where I couldn't do both at a high level. And something had to change. I was getting really fatigued, really burnt out. And I took the decision 10 years ago to stop my corporate career, my corporate job, so I could focus full time on my passion for adventure, for mountaineering. And now, during that 10 years, I've done a number of things. One, I launched a training and expedition company, which is I work with individuals, I work with business teams of people, taking them out into new environments that's going to put them under a little bit of pressure, perhaps something that's new to them, but a great environment where they can learn. And that generally involves mountains. So in the UK, we take teams of people into our British mountains. They're not very high, but they're still a lot of fun. And I also run through Fitways Adventures international trips. Good examples would be I take teams up Kilimanjaro, I take teams up Everest, I take teams into the Amazon rainforest. So there's a real mixture in what I do with Fitways Adventures. We've got quite a broad portfolio of products.
That's amazing job. And of course, a lot of people will be excited with this because maybe they can contact with you. And we have a lot of people from UK. I've been there twice. So maybe some people can contact with your company and make these expeditions. Yes,
that would be great. Yeah, and if anyone's interested or even just needs a little bit of advice, feel free to get in touch with me, and at the end we can give my contact details out. I'd be delighted to help in any way I can.
Thank you so much, Nick. And when and how did you start with this project, with the 7 Summit Challenge, and which one was the first mountain to climb?
That's a brilliant question. The first of the 7 summits that I climbed was Kilimanjaro, and many of your listeners certainly everybody will be aware of Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa, and that makes it one of the 7 summits. And I first climbed Kilimanjaro 20 years ago. And when I climbed it, I didn't ever think that I was going to go on and climb the 7 summits. I knew about the 7 summits. It was something that I dreamed about doing, but I didn't think I'd ever do it. But after climbing Kilimanjaro, I thought, wow, well, what's next? Maybe I could climb 2 of the 7 summits. And several years later, I picked Everest. And Everest sits in Russia, the highest mountain in Russia, and made an expedition with some friends. And we were successful. It took us 2 attempts to climb that mountain. The first attempt was a bit of a failure. And that's great because when we fail, we learn, we develop, and we went back to Everest. We made our second attempt and we were successful. And after Everest, I started thinking maybe I could climb 3 of the 7 summits. And a couple of years passed, and I then went out and climbed with a small team of friends, Aconcagua, the highest mountain in the Andes. It sits in Argentina, and it's nearly 7,000 meters high. So you're getting into quite serious altitudes. And the journey just went on from there. After Aconcagua, I thought, wow, maybe I could climb 4 of the 7 summits. So we planned, just me and a friend, a very good friend, a trip to Denali, highest mountain in Alaska. And that's a really, really tough mountain. If I'm honest, a harder mountain to climb than Everest from personal experience. We just had 2 of us. We set out. It's a very, very remote place. The mountain sits 100 miles from civilization, and it's very, very cold. It's located very close to the Arctic Circle, so the conditions on that mountain are really, really extreme. But we were successful. We were successful in climbing the mountain. We got back, and then started thinking maybe I could do 5. And that's how the journey went on, until finally there was 1 mountain left to climb, and you know which one that is. That's the biggest. That's Everest, right? And that was the last mountain that I needed to climb on that journey. And I'm sure I'll be sharing that journey with you a little bit later on.
How many years ago did you climb Everest?
I climbed Everest in 2019. So literally, not even 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago. And the interesting thing with the pandemic is during the 2020 season, Hardly any people climbed it. There were a very, very small team from China that made a summit bid. But from the Nepalese side, from Nepal, no climbers were permitted on the mountain because of the pandemic. So actually, I was one of the last people to have climbed Everest.
Nick, how is everything before the expedition? I mean, preparation, physically and mentally, equipment, mountain, and everything. What did you need, or what do you really need to climb Everest?
Brilliant question. Okay. I think the first thing you need to climb Everest is experience. When I was on Everest in 2019's season, I was amazed, in fact, to discover that some mountaineers were trying to climb Everest with very little experience. And that's not a good thing. You may get lucky, and you may be fortunate in that situation to climb it, but your probability of failure, both in terms of not making it to the top, but much more importantly, not ever coming off that mountain alive, is hugely increased if you don't have experience. So for me, the number one thing is having years of mountaineering experience where you've spent time dealing with lots of different scenarios, dealing with challenges, where you've got to know your own body, you've got to know your own limits, because that's something else that's really important on Everest. It's not just a question of saying, I'm going to climb as hard as I can, and it doesn't matter, I'm just going to push through and keep pushing. Because if you take that attitude, it's probably not going to end well for you. Because you've also got to remember with Everest, the summit is only halfway. You've still got to get back down from the summit. So the inexperienced mountaineers, my experience is, they considered the summit to be the goal, the end point, and they'd use all their energy trying to get to the top. But the problem then is, yes, I've summited Everest, I've got a photograph of me on the top, but they don't have the energy to get back down off that mountain. So for me, it's all about experience, knowing yourself, operating in different conditions, different environments. But coming back then to the planning phase, what planning and what training do you need to do to climb Everest? Personally, because I'm a mountain guide, I spend a lot of time operating and working in the mountains. I didn't really need to do too much. There wasn't much in terms of skills I needed to develop because of my history. There were certain particular bits of equipment that I needed to buy. One thing with Everest, and you'll see when you see Everest mountaineers, they're all wearing these down suits, these huge suits. They're like sleeping bags with arms and legs. So I needed to buy a down suit. There were a few other bits of equipment, but most of it I had already because of Denali, and the temperatures and the conditions on Denali are quite similar to Everest. It gets about as cold. You deal with strong winds. So I had most of the equipment anyway to climb it. You also then talk about how do you prepare your body, training. And the listeners might not like this answer, but for me, the month before I flew to Nepal to climb the mountain, I started doing less training. So I cut back on the training and I started eating more than I normally would because from experience, I know that you lose a lot of weight, body mass on these big expeditions. Average on Everest is somewhere between 15 and 20 kilos people will lose of weight. So for me, I wanted to be put on some weight, so that meant I'd have energy and reserves on the climb. Because when you think about Everest, the start of the climb is quite easy. You've got a trek, you've got 10 days to go to base camp, you've got plenty of time at base camp. You then do the what's called the rotations, where you spend time acclimatizing on the section after base camp. So it might be 6 weeks after you arrive on the mountain before you make your summit bid, before you make that summit attempt. So you've got to be thinking, I need to be in really good condition in 6 weeks' time, not when I arrive. So I've got to factor in to say, well, actually, in 6 weeks after I arrive, I've probably lost 15 kilograms of body mass. So I want to be heavy when I start. And also I want to be really well rested before I start, because the expedition is so long. You're going to get very fit while you're out there. If you turn up, and this was a mistake again that a lot of inexperienced mountaineers made, is they arrived incredibly fit. They arrived with these kind of muscly bodies. They had no body fat on themselves. But the problem is they peaked at the start. By the time they'd spent 6 weeks on the mountain, they had no energy. They were very, very skinny. They'd lost so much weight. So yeah, surprisingly for me, it's actually make sure that you're well rested, that you've got no injuries, and that you've got some extra body weight so that you, by the time you go for your summit, you're in the best condition at that point, because that's when you need to be your strongest, not at the start of the expedition.
Thanks so much. It's really very interesting and wow, amazing. Because some people thinks that is that everybody can go to Everest. Of course, you need a lot of money or go with a big team, right? Because it's expensive expedition.
Yes, so let's talk about cost. How much does it cost to climb Everest? So most mountaineers will pay somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 US dollars. For me, I was able to climb it quite a lot cheaper than that because of my experience in the mountains. And you get what you pay for. So if you spend $100,000, when you're in base camp, you're going to have lovely tents. You're going to have a lovely area where the team can all meet, and you're going to have really good quality food. For me, I spent about $20,000. So I made some compromises. So I didn't have particularly good quality food when I was at base camp. It was fine, it was adequate, but it wasn't certainly luxury food. But there were things that I didn't compromise on. For me, I wanted to make sure that I was working with a very, very experienced climbing Sherpa. And I was fortunate, the Sherpa that I climbed Everest with, I've worked and climbed with for the last 7 years. So I knew my Sherpa really, really well. We're very, very good friends. That's incredibly important because you're going to form a little team, you and your Sherpa, on the Everest climb. And that needs to be a team that works because you're both putting your lives in each other's hands. So that piece is incredibly important when you're climbing Everest. But other than that, and also oxygen. The other thing you need to make sure when you climb Everest is you've got oxygen available to you if you need it on the mountain. Now, some teams, what we found is they weren't providing enough oxygen for the clients. And that meant the clients had less options. So for example, once they got into the death zone, and I'll be talking about the death zone shortly, they only had one shot at climbing to the summit. If you were working with a team where there was more oxygen available, let's say you get to the South Col. The South Col is the last camp that you stop at before you climb to the summit. And let's say the weather is deteriorated. The weather's not good. Well, if you've got oxygen, you can spend a night in a tent and maybe delay your summit by 24 hours. So oxygen is really important on the climb. And it was quite interesting in the 2019 season is there were some teams stealing oxygen as well. So you had certain teams that in advance would bury oxygen in the snow, make little depots, but other teams were stealing it. So then when you went to find your oxygen, the oxygen had gone. So there were some problems with oxygen. It's kind of like oxygen's like gold up on Everest.
Wow, it's very important. Okay, Nick, everybody pay attention. Your dream starts. It's the day you was waiting for, Nick. And I was watching your videos and listening to you, and it's really amazing. So can you share with us all the expedition sensations, cool, fair, problems, work team, because it's very important, acclimatization and acclimatization is right?
That's correct. Acclimatization, yeah.
Acclimatization. And what did you eat? What did you drink? How many days? All the experience, if you can share with us, please.
I'd be delighted. So let's start right from Kathmandu. So Kathmandu is the capital city of Nepal, and this is the point where everybody flies into. I met my team for the first time in Kathmandu, and it was an really interesting bunch of people. Now, you literally have one dinner together, and then the following day we flew into the mountains, and the area is called the Khumbu. And you have to fly into an airport called Lukla. And Lukla Airport is widely known as the most dangerous airport in the world. Now, for me, I usually fly in on helicopter because that's safer than flying in on planes. So this occasion, I flew in on a helicopter. And actually, I had some friends that came in with me because they wanted to walk up to base camp. So I thought that'd be a really nice idea to have some time with some good friends. And from Lukla, you then trek up to Everest Base Camp. And there's no real difference between you being an Everest climber and a trekker that's going to Everest Base Camp. You work on a pretty similar schedule, you stay in the same places. And most of the trekkers wouldn't even know that we're Everest climbers. I kind of kept it very low key, because the problem then is if they find out you're climbing Everest, they want to talk to you for 3-4 hours in the evening, and you really want to be focused on what you're doing. So you kind of go in disguise and you spend about 10 days making your way from Lukla Airport all the way up to base camp. And you don't want to rush that because that's a really important part of the acclimatization process. So if we think about it, Lukla sits at 2,800 meters, Everest Base Camp is at 5,300 meters. And what you want to do is travel nice and slowly, not stress the body at all during this period, take plenty of rest, make sure you're drinking lots, make sure you're eating lots. Because all the while you're trying to get your body to produce more red blood cells, because it's the red blood cells in our system that are the oxygen carriers. And you want to develop as more of those as possible. And the way to do that is to strain the body by going high, but also by having plenty of rest to allow the body to do its thing, allow the body to produce those red blood cells. So you arrive at Everest Base Camp 10 days later. The difference now is the trekkers, they've achieved their goal. They've got their celebration photographs, they're going to spend half an hour at base camp, and then they're going to make their way back down. And that's their trip, their holiday over. For us, when we arrive at base camp, this is where it starts. And it's quite interesting. So you're now at base camp. Base camp is like a little town. There are probably getting on 1,000 people when you've got all the Sherpas, porters and what have you up there, and you get your little area and you're given your own tent. So I had my own tent with just my stuff in it. And you need that because you want to have your own privacy, your own space. Most teams then will have a cooking tent, and they'll have a central community tent. This is a big tent where you can go and have your meals, go and socialize, drink cups of tea and what have you. So that's the setup at base camp. So you'll spend a few days in base camp, just letting the body acclimatize to that 5,300 meters, because that might not sound very high, but there's about 50% available oxygen at base camp. So it's the equivalent to having one lung working, if that's to give you a feeling. So everything's hard work. And initially you need to do everything very slowly. A lot of people are struggling with things like headaches, that we call it AMS, acute altitude sickness. So you just need to keep drinking, keep looking after your body. And then as the days go on, you feel better and better. The next thing that we did as a team is we climbed a different mountain, a mountain called Le Bouchier, which is about 6,100 meters high. And the reason that we did that, A, it was a little bit more interesting, but secondly, it reduced the number of times that we had to travel through the Cumbre Icefall. And when you're climbing Everest, immediately after base camp, you're confronted with the Cumbre, and it's a glacier, and it's absolutely huge, this thing. And everybody will have seen the pictures where you've got the ladders that cross the crevasses, and they can be pretty difficult, pretty tricky to get across. And every time you go through that Cumbre Icefall, it's dangerous. You're taking a risk. And every year, climbers and Sherpa lose their lives in the Cumbre Icefall, so it's really serious. So for us, by climbing a 6,200 meter mountain before, it meant we only needed to go through that Cumbre Icefall 3 times, make 3 rotations. So that reduced the level of risk, and it made it more fun as well. So you're now back at base camp. You've climbed your 6,200 meter mountain, and it's time to get onto Everest for real. So you have to go through the Cumbre Icefall, and the first time it's really nerve-wracking. The whole thing, it feels like it's alive. It's creaking, it's groaning. You've got these huge ice blocks that are the size of large buildings. And the whole thing's unstable. You know, sometimes you can hear these big seracs, these big blocks of ice falling and crashing, and it's quite a nerve-wracking place to be. So the first time we went through the Cumbre Icefall, we just traveled through up to Camp 1, spent a night in a tent, and then returned to base camp. We then waited at base camp, let the body get strong, get used to those higher altitudes, and produce more red blood cells. We then went back, and these little mini climbs are the way that we prepare the body, and they're called rotations. So I went back on the mountain and made my second climb. So I went up to Camp 1, spent a night at Camp 1, then climbed further up to Camp 2, spent a night at Camp 2, but we had a real challenge because a storm came in that night and most of the tents were ripped to pieces. We had, in my tent, for example, I ended up with 2 other people that their tents had been destroyed. So we had a really stressful night. It just went on for hour after hour. And when the sun came up in the morning, we literally just grabbed all the equipment we could find and made our way back down to base camp. And that was it. Then you're playing a waiting game. And what you're doing with Everest is waiting for a weather window. And that's a period of sustained good weather where you can get up to the top, get the photograph and get back down alive. It's as simple as that. But in 2019 there was a problem. The window was late. It came very, very late in May. Quite often it's earlier in May. You know, some climbers will be summiting Everest around about the 5th, 6th of May. But this season it was very late. And also it was only 3 days long. So this meant you had 200 mountaineers in my climbing community that were all targeting that 3-day window. And I knew that was going to be a problem because it was going to mean that there were going to be high volumes of people up on the high part of Everest. And that's not good. I'll explain why in a moment. So the window came and we all started making our way back up the mountain. So for me, I climbed back through the Cumbre Icefall, but when I arrived at Camp 1, I was really acclimatized. I had plenty of energy, so I just pushed all the way up to Camp 2 in one go. I spent a night at Camp 2, and all you're doing is trying to eat, drink, and sleep. Those are your priorities. You've got to get hydrated. You've got to try and get food into you, because as you get high on Everest, your appetite goes down. Your body doesn't want food. So you have to force yourself to eat. And you do your best you can to sleep, but it's really, really difficult. The body doesn't like to sleep with this limited amount of oxygen. Now, the next day from Camp 2 to Camp 3 is a really challenging day because you have to climb the Lhotse face. And that is a huge face of snow and ice, and it's very, very steep, and it's hard work. And halfway up the Lhotse face, you make Camp 3. And Camp 3 is nothing more than a little platform that you cut in the snow and ice, just big enough for your tent to fit. And again, the routine is the same. Eat, drink, and sleep. But in order to drink, you need to melt snow, and that's a really that's quite a challenging thing to do. By this point, sleeping is almost impossible. You're at 7,400 meters. You're starting to enter the death zone. Your body is starting to break down and die. So sleep's really, really difficult. And the same thing with eating. You just have to try and force food into yourself, but you have no appetite at all. So you do the best you can. And then the next day, you're making the journey from Camp 3 up to the South Col, otherwise known as Camp 4. So first light, you start the journey. Now, most teams are now on oxygen. They either use oxygen from Camp 2 or they go on oxygen at Camp 3. And I remember the day really well, traveling from Camp 3 up to the South Col. It was hard work. There were a lot of mountaineers, so I was stuck in a traffic jam of climbers, and it was really, really slow. For me personally, I move quite fast at high altitudes. But overtaking people is impossible when you're in this queue of mountaineers. And the whole day took me 12 hours. I would have expected it to take me about 5 hours to make that journey. It took 12, and that was really frustrating. The other thing that happened on that day is it was the first time that I encountered a dead body on Everest. And it wasn't a body from years before. I was expecting to see a lot of that. It was a body from a mountaineer that had died that morning, still clipped into the safety line. So that meant that we all had to walk straight past this poor guy. And that affects you mentally when you see that, when you know that you've got Everest to climb and you're looking at the potential consequence of what you're doing. And you need to do a lot of work. And this is where experience comes in as mountaineers. Experienced mountaineers are very good at managing their minds, managing their thoughts. For an inexperienced mountaineer, it's likely to freak them out. They're likely to panic. And I remember a member of our team, when we arrived at the South Col, she was in a horrendous state. And I'm pretty sure that's because she'd seen this dead body and her brain was really struggling to compute with what she was doing. All of a sudden, I think the reality struck for her. She started to think, oh, maybe this is really a lot more serious than I was thinking. So after 12 hours, I arrived at the South Col. And when I arrived at the South Col, the weather had deteriorated. We were expecting good weather, but the winds were really strong. It was really cloudy. You had no visibility. And we had a big decision to make at the South Col. So I had a good chat with Pemba. Pemba's my climbing Sherpa. As I said, he's an incredibly good friend of mine. We've climbed, we've worked together for many years. And we were chatting through the options. And the situation was this. You've now got about 200 mountaineers at the South Col. The weather's bad. And this meant that the majority of the mountaineers were not going to be able to climb that night. The conditions were too serious. So they were going to go into tents using their oxygen and then make their attempt the following day. So we knew that the following day was going to be a big problem on the high section of Everest because it was going to mean queues. And we also knew there were a lot of inexperienced mountaineers in that mix. And what that meant was those inexperienced mountaineers were going to be slow on the difficult parts. Because on Everest, some of the more technical parts is actually very high on the mountain. You've got the Hillary Step, for example, you've got the summit ridge, and also the climb up to the south summit. This is quite difficult, not crazy difficult, but it's quite challenging technical climbing. And inexperienced people were very, very slow on that. And that creates bottlenecks where you get traffic jams or queues of people. And the problem then is everybody's on oxygen, and those bottles of oxygen will last anywhere between 4 and 8 hours, depending on how much flow you have, how much oxygen you're using. So if you get stuck in a queue for 3 hours, that can be the difference between making a successful summit climb or, unfortunately, never coming off that mountain again, being stuck there for forever. So Pemba and I didn't want to get caught up in that. And we decided that we had the skills and experience to climb that night in the tough conditions, in the strong winds, in the bad visibility. And we made the decision, we decided it was going to be less risky to do that than it was to climb the following day and get stuck in the queues. So this meant we literally had 3 hours to prepare for our summit bid, 3 hours to drink as much as possible, because that is so important, hydration at these high altitudes. Try to eat something. Now, most mountaineers can't eat anything from the South Col. I did pretty well. I managed to eat 4 Mars bars. I ate a Snickers bar and a big pack of biscuits. And that was great because it meant that I was going to have energy on the higher section of the climb. And I set off at 9 p.m. on the 21st of May. I left my tent. At this point, I was climbing alone. Pemba, he was very, very experienced. He was needed to help with another team. So I was actually climbing on my own. And interestingly, about 50 other mountaineers made the same decision as Pemba and I to climb that night. And when I got out of my tent, I could see this string of head torches going up into the distance. And I realized I was actually one of the last to leave. I was feeling a little bit, maybe I've gone a bit too late, but it was okay. So I'm climbing alone. And after 5 minutes from leaving my tent, I encountered another dead body. And just lying down on the trail. And I remember looking down thinking, what's happened? And again, this wasn't a mountaineer from years before. I later discovered it was a mountaineer that had died that day, and literally just lying there on the ground, because at those altitudes, there's not really much you can do. You can't just say, oh, I'll pick you up and drag you. You haven't got the energy to do that. But that's not a good thing to see just as you're about to climb Everest in bad weather. So again, I needed to really focus my mind, get that out and start focusing on what I needed to do to ensure that that didn't happen to me. Now, on my summit bid, I was climbing really well. I felt really strong and I seemed to be moving faster than the other mountaineers. So I was finding myself overtaking them, and then I'd clip back into the safety line and keep working up. And after about an hour, two things happened. Firstly, Pemba caught me up, because the thing people don't realize is the Sherpa community are far stronger than the Western mountaineers. These guys are born at 4,000 meters, even higher in some cases. They're physiologically adapted to these extreme altitudes. So Pemba caught up with me. I overtook a mountaineer and I looked ahead and realized there was nobody else ahead of me. So I had the whole mountain to myself, and it was the most incredible experience. Probably felt very similar to when Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first climbed Everest. But it also meant that there was no trail. There were no ropes. All the old ropes were buried in new snow. So in order to make progress up the mountain, we needed to break snow trail. We needed to wade through the snow. So Pemba and I just took turns. He'd do a section, I'd do a section. And for about 3 hours, we just, without exchanging a single word, we just worked our way up the mountain until we got to a place called the balcony. Now, you may have heard of the balcony. It's considered the halfway point on summit day. And it's an area of relatively flat ground where you can take a rest, have a little chill out. So we got to the balcony and we were quite a long way ahead of all the other climbers that were coming up the mountain. And Pemba and I had a chat, and we agreed that it would be best to wait for the other climbers to catch up with us so they could help us break trail on the second section of the mountain, because to my knowledge, it's certainly unusual if it's ever happened that just two mountaineers have put in the trail the whole way up, because it's very, very tiring, very physically demanding to do that. But the problem we had is the wind was strong and we were getting really cold just standing on the balcony. And after about half an hour, we needed to do something because we were starting to get at risk of frostbite, particularly fingers and toes. I was wiggling my fingers, I was wiggling my toes, just to keep the blood circulation to stop that risk of frostbite. And in the end, I just thought, we've got to do something. We need to move to get warm. So I called to Pemba, who was smoking a cigarette at 8,400 meters. He's just sitting down, relaxing, having a cigarette. I'm like, Pemba, we've got to go, come on. So anyway, so we set off. I was in the lead, Pemba was behind me, across the ridge that leads up to the bottom of the south summit. And after about 20 minutes, my oxygen system blocked up. I couldn't breathe. I was trying to breathe through it and I couldn't get any air. In the end, I just stopped using it. I was breathing better without oxygen than with it. And then when Pemba caught up with me, I said, look, Pemba, we've got a problem. We need to go down. This is broken, this reg. And Pemba was amazing. He just said, don't worry, I can fix it. And he took a deep breath and he blew into the valve that sits on the side of my regulator, the piece that goes around my mouth. And it worked. It cleared the blockage. It also meant that I had Pemba's cigarette breath going straight into my mouth, which was pretty gross. But I could breathe again. And we carried on. But then at the base of the climb up to the south summit, this happened again. And this time Pemba breathing into it wasn't working. And I started to panic a little bit. I started to think, I'm at 8,600 meters. I can't breathe. And I wasn't sure if I could get back down without oxygen. So I said, Pemba, come on, let's start going down now. This is a problem. And again, he was amazing. He was super relaxed and said, don't worry, I can fix it. Give me your mask. And this is kind of a big display of trust. So I hand Pemba my mask and he then takes it to pieces. So it's 2 o'clock in the morning. The wind is strong and using our head torches, Pemba takes my mask to bits and then gets the ice out. There was some ice causing the blockage And then he put it back together again, handed it to me, and I could breathe. And without Pemba, the climb was certainly over, and potentially I was not going to get off that mountain. He was just unbelievable. From that point, you need to climb up to the south summit, and that's really steep. It takes about an hour and a half, and it's very, very steep, and probably the most technical climbing on Everest itself. And when we arrived on the south summit, I knew then that we were going to be okay. We were going to make it. It was still dark, probably about 4 o'clock in the morning. But I was feeling really strong. We had loads of oxygen left because I was using a very, very low flow rate of oxygen. I was fortunate I didn't need too much supplementary oxygen, and that meant we had plenty of oxygen left, and we were climbing quite fast as well. So from that point, we changed our oxygen bottles. So we had fresh bottles, and I then led the route up towards the summit. Pemba was just behind me. And with big mountains, the last bit is always the most difficult in some respects. You can't see the summit. So you just have to keep moving forward, and you're moving pretty slow at this point as well because of the altitude. But I've come to learn from experience that you've got the goal, you've got the dream, you just need to keep taking one more step. Always just keep, even if it's a small step, keep moving towards that goal. And eventually you'll achieve the goal, the summit will come. And for me, the summit did arrive. I arrived at this mound of snow and ice, and it had some Tibetan prayer flags in it, as you may have seen in photographs of the top of Everest. And I knew then that I'd done it. I've climbed Everest. I was standing on the top of the world. But the excitement, in fact, sorry, carry on.
No. Just I'm listening to you, and it's there are a lot of questions on my mind. It's like I'm there with you. I'm like climbing with you when I'm listening to you. It's like, wow, I cannot imagine the experience. My top was 2,000 meters, so I can't imagine how it's be there on the top of the wall. But I want to ask you, how many degrees is there?
In temperature Celsius, probably got down to minus 35, minus 40. But the other thing you need to consider is the wind chill. So you've got your ambient temperature, but then when you have the wind, that always makes things colder. And particularly if you've got any flesh exposed to the wind as well. So the relative temperature obviously is significantly lower than that. But I didn't actually check the temperature, but yeah, I probably got down to something down in that region, down to maybe minus 40. And this is the incredible thing with these big high altitude peaks, is during the night or when the sun is blocked by cloud, they're unbelievably cold. But then when the sun comes up, suddenly you can go from, let's say, minus 30 degrees Celsius to plus 30 degrees Celsius in the space of 10 minutes. So you're having to deal with these extreme temperature ranges. So you're either too cold or you're absolutely unbelievably overheating. You're just too hot. But yeah, so do you want me to take you from the summit? What happened next?
So, one more question. I see that it's very important, the team, the work team, and the people, that you have to trust in them and they have to trust in you. I think it's very important, and your mind. So I have 4 words I told you the other day. It's survival and come home alive. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll use slightly different words, but exactly the same thing. In mountaineering, we have a saying: stay alive, stay friends, and summit. And do it in that order. So when people say, what's my goal when I'm climbing Everest or any other big mountain? They say, surely your goal is to get to the top. I disagree. My number one goal is always survival. It's coming back down alive. That's much more important than the summit. The second is stay friends. So usually when I climb with a small team, and the most important thing is that we enjoy ourselves as a team, we have a great trip, and we come back as friends. Because if we do that, we've got a great team, then they can go on and have future experiences. We can climb other mountains in the future. If everybody ends the trip where they all hate each other, they're all arguing, you don't have a team to go in and have to enjoy future experiences. So the team is the next most important. Only then, the summit. That's your third and a very distant third goal, is making it to the summit. And the mistake I think inexperienced mountaineers make is they prioritize the summit at all costs. They're going to get to the summit. And this means that they have a high risk of losing their life, and also a very good probability that they're going to lose friends. They're going to have maybe lifetime friendships are going to be destroyed in just one expedition. And that's, for me, is crazy. That's not the priorities. They've got those priorities wrong.
Nick, when was in all the expedition the worst moment for you?
I've had a number, and any experienced mountaineers will have had a number. But for me, it was one was actually the summit of Everest. And because when I arrived and I realized I'd climbed it, I looked out on my right-hand side across Tibet, expecting to see the most beautiful view in the world. I mean, the best view in the world. And I couldn't see anything. It was like I was looking through a glass window that had steamed up. And my heart sank, and I realized I was blind. I'd lost my vision on the top of Everest. And what had happened is, because the wind was very strong during the night, I took my goggles off because they'd iced over. And I thought, okay, this is okay. It's a safe thing to do because there's no sun, so I'm not going to get snow blind. But what had happened, and the same thing happened to a number of Sherpa as well, is the little ice crystals that were being blown into my eyes had scratched the surface of my eyes. So when the sun came up, I just couldn't see anything. So I was standing on the top of the Everest, completely blind, thinking, I'm stuffed. Because on Everest, nobody can rescue you. No helicopter can fly that high. After we arrived, the next climbers started to arrive on the summit, but no one can help, because at those altitudes, everyone's just got the energy to put one foot in front of the other. They haven't got any spare residual capacity to help. So you have to get yourself back down off Everest. That's the reality of it. And Pember and I had a real challenge getting back down. We had an unbelievably difficult descent where he was having to be my eyes. We had to get back down across the summit ridge. We had to negotiate 6 abseils getting back off the south summit. I fell off 3 times. I fell off the summit ridge 3 times. But was luckily able to catch myself and climb back up to Pember. So yeah, that was a pretty scary few hours, I have to say. And at several points, I genuinely didn't think I was going to get back down off the mountain alive.
Wow, I can't imagine, but now we go with I'm not going to do the question, because I hope and I think that the best moment was on the top of the world. And 8,848 meters. What did you feel when you was on the top of the world, on the summit of Everest?
For about 30 seconds, I felt a mixture of emotions. Fatigued, tired, because you've got to remember, when you arrive there, you haven't slept for days. You're pretty exhausted. Pember and I have been breaking trail for hours. You've got 20% available oxygen, so the equivalent to having half of one lung. So you don't feel brilliant. You don't feel great. But there was a part of me going, yes, I've done it. But as I say, then when I looked out to my right-hand side, I just felt a feeling of dread. I was thinking, oh no, you've blown it. You're going to die. So yeah, a real mixture of emotions in the space of about 5 minutes. And after that, my emotion was 100% focus. I need to get down. I need to get down alive. I wasn't scared. I wasn't worried. I was completely in the zone, completely in the moment, just using every bit of energy, every bit of mental concentration I had to getting back down alive.
So how long, Nick, can you be on the summit? How many minutes?
We were on the summit not for long, because we had the problem with my vision, and all I wanted to do once I realized was take that piece of video that I shared with you. So we did about 1-2 minutes of video, and then we went down. Had that not happened, I was feeling pretty strong relative to Everest and other mountaineers. I probably would have spent half an hour up on the top. My plan was to make some nice videos for friends. I had a teddy bear that I'd carried up with me, so I was going to do a little thing for that. So I had a plan to do, make some nice messages from the summit of Everest. But because of that, I literally just made a very short video, and then we were heading back down.
Yeah, we're gonna share your videos, amazing videos, with everyone in the video, and they can see and they can like be with you. It's incredible, and thank you so much again to share the videos with me and with all the people, because it's gonna be amazing, really. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
Nick, you was talking a little bit about the end of the expedition when you have to come down. You think it's harder because you are tired and it's the end and you really want to go to back?
Yeah, it's always challenging getting back down from these big mountains. And this is one of the mistakes that inexperienced mountaineers, that they use all their energy to get to the top. So when you think about the descent from Everest, I had a real problem because I had no vision. That made it very difficult. But even if I had perfect vision, you've got to get all the way back across the summit ridge. You've got some technical abseiling to do. You then have got a long journey back down to the South Col. But typically you won't then stop at the South Col, because South Col sits at 8,000 meters. It's in the death zone. So you're not going to hang around there. We had 1 cup of tea at the South Col, had a little rest, and then we carried back down all the way to Camp 2. So for us, if we take Pembrose and I, really our summit started from when we left Camp 3 2 days before, because we left Camp 3 to get to the South Col. We literally had 3 hours just to eat and try and drink as much as possible. Then we were off again. We made our summit bed. Then we went back to the South Col. We had a cup of tea, and then we carried on all the way back down to Camp 2. So we were out for well over 30 hours, battling the elements on very little food. You have practically no water. For example, on my summit, when I left the South Col, I carried half a litre of water with me in a bottle, and I didn't even drink any of it. It froze. It was in my pocket and it froze after about half an hour. So you've got to do all of that. I remember, so when I got back to Camp 2, I was unbelievably dehydrated. You've got a headache, like the worst headache you could ever describe. And I remember I went for a wee to the toilet, and it was black in colour. It was like so dehydrated. And when I got back to Camp 2, I drank literally cup after cup after cup of tea. And then you're so exhausted, just got into a sleeping bag and asleep.
How many days did you spend in total, go at the beginning to the summit, and how many days, of course, spent to back down?
Oh, that's such a good question. So it takes nearly 6 weeks to climb it. So if you take the start of the expedition being arriving in Lukla in the Cumbre region of Nepal, so 6 weeks to get up to the summit, and then you get off the mountain unbelievably quickly. So for example, I made it from the summit back down to Camp 2. Then the following day, I went from Camp 2 back to base camp. And at base camp was amazing because you've got the reception of all the team. And we talked a lot, you were talking about team. And for me, the team on Everest is the Sherpa community, not specifically the climbing community, but they're unbelievable, these guys. They're just incredible. And I remember the reception that waited for me when I got back. Everyone's hugging each other. It's really emotional. And then, but the thing is, once you've climbed it, you just want to go home. Like, you're done. You've been there for so long and you just want to go home. And the great thing is, if you're willing to spend some money, you can get off Everest really quickly. I paid $1,000 the next day and got a helicopter back to Kathmandu. So I went from the summit of Everest to 2 days later, I'm in Kathmandu in a restaurant, having a lovely meal and what have you. And then I stayed in Kathmandu for a few days, and then I flew back to the UK. So it's incredibly quick how the expedition finishes.
Yeah, so it's 6 weeks, and then a few days, no, 2 days.
Yeah, 2 days.
Unbelievable.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
Nick, I know this is hard, but you was talking a little bit about the death area, and a lot of people see pictures and read about that. But from your experience, what do you feel when you are there and you see the bodies? And of course, if you can talk about the impossibility to bring down the bodies from the Everest.
Yeah, absolutely. So the death zone, some people say the death zone starts from Camp 3, 7,400 meters. Other people will say the death zone starts at 8,000 meters. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's when you get to a point where there's not enough oxygen to sustain life. So once you enter the death zone, what this means is your body is starting to get weaker and weaker. It's breaking down and dying. So it's a race against time to get to the top and get back down. And the whole time you're aware that your body there's damage is happening to your body. So for example, most Everest summiteers will have incurred permanent brain damage. So there's no question I will have damaged cells in my brain because of what I've done at those high altitudes. So you want to get this done as quickly as possible. You've also got to remember that you don't think in the same way as you do at sea level. Like we're here right now thinking very clearly, very fast. But when those higher altitudes in the death zone, your brain works much more slowly. It's like maybe you've drank lots of alcohol. So maybe you've had a bottle of wine, something like that. That's a bit the same. So then you see dead bodies. Now, for me, I've seen lots of dead bodies in mountains on other expeditions. So it's not a big shock to me. And I was expecting to see it. On Everest, I was expecting, though, to see a lot of dead bodies from previous seasons, from years gone by. But I didn't see any from previous seasons, but I saw plenty from my climbing community, the season I was up there. And that does affect you. Perhaps it affects you more when you get back down. When you're actually there climbing for the summit, you're so focused. I was able, certainly personally, to say, okay, that's not good. I don't want that to happen to me. I'm going to make sure I do everything to ensure. So it was a good reminder to focus on all the basics, to focus on hydration, focus on temperature regulation, focus on just maintaining concentration, not losing concentration. But I think it's only after the climb that you really have an opportunity, have time to reflect on what's happened. So, and then getting bodies back down from Everest, yeah, it's from the top section, it's pretty much an impossibility. What they tend to do is throw them into crevasses, so they're not in view, they're out of the way, and that's what you'd expect. Now, for me personally, if I was to die on Everest, on the top section, I wouldn't want anyone trying to take my body down, because there's a huge risk involved. You're dead. There's no life to save. So it seems crazy to me to risk other people's life to get bodies back. But what was happening on the mountain when I was there is there were teams of Sherpa trying to retrieve bodies. It's very expensive. It's about $100,000 to do. But some of the governments of the countries where these climbers were really keen to retrieve the bodies, maybe for a funeral or whatever. And they were spending this $100,000 to try and get the body down. For me, I disagree with it. If you climb a mountain like Everest, you're taking a big risk. And you should also be responsible for yourself. There should be no expectation that other people should have to incur risk because of your decision making. So I don't agree with what was happening there. If you're big enough and grown up enough to climb a mountain like Everest, you need to be prepared to accept the risk you're taking. And if that means you die, then that's okay. You spend the rest of your time on the mountain. You don't risk other lives to get your dead body down so your family can say goodbye. That's kind of not okay in my book.
Just 3 weeks ago or something like that, one Spanish man dead over there. So it's like a lot of people they have to think about, and like you say, be ready, not only physically and mentally, and with experience, of course. Yes.
Nick, some words attract my attention. Is all we have our Everest to climb.
I saw it, and it's like, I think behind that words is more. No, it's something like you can make your dreams come true.
Absolutely. And I talk about this a lot, and people often ask me and say, Nick, could I climb Everest? Do you think I could climb Everest? Now, my answer is this. If you really want to climb Everest, if it's something you're really passionate about, it means a huge amount to you. And also, if you're willing to pay the ultimate price. In the case of Everest, the ultimate price is you may lose your life for your dream, for your passion. Then yes, I think most people, providing you're relatively physically fit and strong and able, don't have any pre-existing conditions, most people could climb Everest. It's not unbelievably hard. It's difficult, it's challenging, but I've certainly climbed other mountains that are a lot more difficult than Everest. So I think most people could climb Everest, but I would ask yourself the question, do you really want to climb Everest? And if it's not something you really want to do, then don't try. Find your Everest. Find something that is really important to you. Find something that's going to take you on an incredible journey, that's going to push your limits. Something you're going to be really proud of, something when you get to the end of your life, you're going to be able to say, wow, I'm here, I did it, I don't have any regrets. Because for me, I think the biggest tragedy in life in general is to get to the end of the period of time we don't know how long we have, and to regret having not done things. To say, I wish I'd done that, or I wish if only I could go back in time, I would have done that. And so I think it's really important to work out and take time to work out, what do you want to do with the time you have in life? You know, what would really take you on an incredible journey, and make a plan to get there. Your Everest, it doesn't have to be the 8,800 meter mountain. It can be something completely different. And also it can be something as crazy as you like, because this is your dream. Quite often I talk to people and they're following goals, and when you actually talk to them, it's not really their goal. It may be their wife's goal, their husband's goal, it may be their parents' goal. But I think it's really important to find your goal, the thing that means the most to you, and start that journey.
Thank you. It's an amazing sentence, really amazing words. And Nick,
I know that you don't have a long time,
but I have only 2 more questions. And then can you talk about 721 challenge, next projects? Is right, 721, yeah?
Yeah, 721 challenge.
Yeah. I was reading, and at the beginning I thought 721, but I see no, it's 721 challenge. Yes,
that's right. Wonderful. So when I finished Everest, and for me Everest was the last mountain that I needed to climb the 7 summits. And I got home, and I remember I was chatting to friends, and they're saying, oh, Nick, you've achieved your dream. You're going to retire, right? You don't need to do any more now. Hang up your boots. And when I reflected on it, I thought, no, I'm not going to retire. And you think back to Everest, for me, it's standing on the summit of Everest, if I'm honest, isn't very important. I didn't see anything from the top. I'd lost my vision. But having the goal, having the dream, now that was important, because it took me on this unbelievable journey, this incredible journey. And I quickly realized that I needed a new journey. I've got hopefully many years left to live. And I was thinking, what could I do? I wanted to do something that would push me physically and mentally, but also I wanted to do something to help protect the planet. Because in my profession as an expedition leader, I get to see some incredible places around the world. I'm so privileged. But everywhere I go, you cannot escape the impact that us humans are having on the planet. It's heartbreaking. The glaciers are melting. When we're talking about things like the North Pole, the South Pole, the polar ice caps are melting. Climate change is real and it's happening. Deforestation is a huge problem. I mean, do you know, every year we're cutting down an area the size of Ireland of primary rainforest, and that won't come back. and that's a carbon capture system, probably the greatest carbon capture system we have. So for me, I really want to start giving back, doing something that will make a tangible difference and help our planet. So I started thinking about what could I do next, and I looked at some options, maybe row the Atlantic, maybe ski to the North Pole, ski to the South Pole. And then I discovered that there was a world first to be had, to do all of them, 7 summits, ski both poles solo, and row the Atlantic. And I had a meeting with an amazing organization called World Land Trust. You probably heard of a wonderful gentleman called Sir David Attenborough. And Sir David Attenborough is a patron. And I had a meeting with him and said, look, I really want to help you. What can I do? What could I do that would help you? And they explained to me that they were trying to buy 4,000 hectares of primary rainforest in Guatemala and make a nature reserve. Really, really strategically important piece of land, huge amounts of biodiversity. And they asked me if I'd help them with the project, because they explained if they didn't buy that land, it was going to be bought by loggers and deforested forever. So I thought, yes, that's a great project for me to be involved in. And I remember then kind of thinking, right, well, we'll dedicate 721 Challenge to that project. And that's really what 721 is. 7 summits, which I've completed, skiing both poles solo, and then rowing the Atlantic Ocean and raising funds for this incredibly important project, and also helping create awareness about climate change. Because for me, I think everything has got quite pessimistic, and you've got the people in the environmental world, some of them are being quite dictatorial, lecturing people, and it doesn't really work so well. So for me, I want to create a platform of optimism to say, guys, look, yes, the situation's bad, but as human beings, and the pandemic, I think, has shown us this, that we're incredibly resourceful, we're incredibly resilient. And if we need to do something and we really put our minds on it, we can make incredible things happen. And that's what this platform is about. It's about getting a message out to individuals to say, there are things we can do individually. We can maybe use renewable energy supplies. We can maybe eat more plant-based foods. That takes a lot of the pressure off the environment. Think about our travel costs. Think about our wastage, our recycling. So there are things we can do individually, but also we want to start working with governments as well to start, just re-emphasizing how important this is. Like right now, we've got a pandemic going on. Yes, it's important, but climate change is probably even more important, right? Certainly for the medium-term future. So that's really what this project is about. My next event is the Atlantic Row. So I've got 10 and a half months to get myself ready to row the Atlantic. And that's a challenge because I've been personally struggling with COVID. I had COVID back in March and I've had a really difficult recovery journey with it. So yeah, it's the Atlantic at the end of this year, and then the North Pole in April 2022, and the South Pole, which is a 60-day solo crossing of Antarctica, at the end of 2022. So that's the project, and it would be amazing if your listeners could follow me on that.
Yeah. Nick, we are going to share all your links, and everybody can find you. And if someone wants to contact with you, it's right to ask you something or to see your amazing job. Yes.
100%. Feel free to get in touch anytime. It might take me a couple of days to get back to you, but I will get back to you, and that'd be amazing.
Thank you so much. Good luck for all the projects you have. I hope we can do another interview, maybe when you have another challenge, because you are going to do it, of course, I'm sure. And only the last thing, if somebody wants really to climb Everest, what would you recommend?
Brilliant question. I would recommend getting some experience. Get some experience yourself independently, and get some experience working with guides. So maybe if you've done nothing before, maybe climb some mountains in your local country. Go and climb a high mountain. Kilimanjaro is a really good one because it's not very technically difficult, but it will give you some experience of altitude. And start a journey that will take you to Everest. And it means you can climb Everest in relative safety. You can really reduce your level of risk. What I don't recommend is saying, right, I'm just going to go and climb one mountain and then I'm going to book a trip on Everest, because that's probably not going to be a good thing to do.
Nick, thank you so much. I'm really very grateful.
And if you want to say something to everybody is listening, something else.
So firstly, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the interview and I hope everyone's found it interesting. And yeah, and just my message is life is short, and take time to find your Everest, find your dream, and then just start a journey that goes in that direction. And for a lot of people, they struggle with the first step. So if there's something you really want to do and maybe you're holding back because you're scared, because somebody's told you you're not good enough, or you think you're not good enough, go and take one step. Just today, do it today. Work out one little thing that will take you one step closer to that dream. And you'll be amazed that that step might lead to another and another and another. And you never know when you're going to end up. So that'd be my message to everyone. I really hope you enjoyed today. And yeah, I'd love to come back and update everyone on the 71 challenge.
Thank you. I was twice in the UK, but if I back again, I will back for sure. Will be a pleasure to meet you.
That would be wonderful, and you'd always be welcome as well. So do let me know
you.
next time you're coming.
And if you come to Spain, of course, you're welcome here.
Thank you so much. That's so kind.
Okay, Nick, so thank you so much. And I hope everybody enjoyed tonight this interview. And see you next week in the 7th door, en la séptima puerta. Gracias, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's recording from South Col of Mount Everest. That's 8,000 meters. And in just a few hours' time, I'm going to be making my attempt on Mount Everest, so summit bid. Just try and think about the enormity of the goal of what's ahead is just too daunting for me. So yeah, just break it down. What do I need to do right now? Chill out. What do I need to do? Get my kit ready. What do I need to do? Make sure that I've got all my clothing right and things in the right pockets, and just break it down in that order. Forget the enormity of it, and hopefully step by step, and they will be little steps, trust me, something magical is going to happen. So we're now halfway up Mount Everest. Yeah, we're quite a long way ahead of all the other climbers. We passed a lot early on, and now we're breaking trail. And we've been doing it for a long time, and it's absolutely exhausting. The challenge we have now is, do we push on, just the two of us? Which means we'll break trail for the entire Everest summit, and that's big. Looking at camber now on the technical section, and we're still in front. There's no exaggeration to say, Camber and I put in the trail for Everest. Very pleased to say, summited Everest. It was tough. Pember and I were first on the top. And we spent a lot of time breaking trail today. So physically we were very, very tired. But actually we got to the top without too much drama. But then it started getting light, the sun came up, and I realised I was completely snowblind. Not sure how. Most likely last night the winds were strong. I was getting a lot of ice crystals in my eyes. And yeah, I really genuinely couldn't see, and I thought I'd blown it. I was having to think to myself, you're at the top of Everest, and you're blind. You're not going home, you're not going to make this. But working with Pemba, we just used what little vision I had, and he guided me down. And I don't know how we did it, but we got down the technical sections. And we're now here, and we're about an hour away from the tent. I'm pretty confident I'm going to be able to make that. So, yeah, quite a day, quite a day.
Muchísimas gracias a todos, espero que hayáis disfrutado de esta serie de programas de Todos tenemos nuestro Everest para escalar. Dar las gracias nuevamente a José Baena, a Ricardo Guerrero, a Sara Bielba y a Nick Hollis. Por supuesto, daros las gracias a todos vosotros por estar ahí siempre detrás apoyando y escuchando el programa, y por supuesto también a las plataformas online, radios online y radios asociadas. Recordar que si queréis poneros en contacto con el programa podéis hacerlo a través del correo electrónico laseptimapuerta@gmail.com, y también lo podéis hacer a través del WhatsApp en el 640 15 39 38. Podéis seguirnos en las redes sociales a través de YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, iVoox, Twitter y Twitch como La Séptima Puerta, sustituyendo las 3x1 siempre, recordarlo. La semana que viene habrá un programa que sí que ya se va a centrar un poquito más en lo que es el misterio, la investigación. Un caso de un lugar con muchísima historia y además con psicofonías. Así que os esperamos la semana que viene aquí en el próximo programa de La Séptima Puerta. Un abrazo muy grande y que tengáis una maravillosa semana. Muy buenas noches.